Welcome back to All Things Creepy. I'm your host, Micah James, and this week we are talking about the legendary tale of Edward Mordrake. This is, for all intents and purposes, an urban legend. If this is the first time you're finding out that Edward Mordrake was not a real person, don't worry, I was in the same boat as you at one point. I, for the longest time, thought that Edward Mordrake was a real person. Sure, I thought that parts of his story were a little over the top and melodramatic, but I just thought it was one of those things where it's like almost like, I know in an earlier episode I talked about the legend of the Green Man or Charlie No Face, and thought it was almost like that, how like, oh, Charlie No Face was based off a real person, but the story of his life just became very legendary. That's not the case. Edward Mordrake just straight up wasn't a real person. But we're going to start with the biography of Edward as if he was a real person, and then we're going to talk about the truth of the matter. So, Edward Mordrake was also known as the man with two faces. He was originally written about in an 1895 Boston Sunday Post article, and the following year was written about in 1896 in the Encyclopedia Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine. Edward was said to be a young, intelligent, good-looking English nobleman and a musician of rare ability. He had a normal face and a second face on the back of his head, which was described as lovely as a dream and hideous as a devil. Now, depending on the source, it'll tell you that Edward's face on the back of his head was either a woman, a hideous witch, or it was just an ugly man. I'll post the most famous picture of him, and I'll talk about that later when we talk about like the truth of the matter. You can make up your mind. Depending on which source you look at will depend on what his back face looked like. Edward was plagued by this twin, which kept whispering these evil things to him. And it was just said, all in all, that this face was just really evil. Apparently, when Ed would cry, the face would smile, and if Edward was happy, the face would like snarl and be upset. He ended up living in seclusion and refused to see even his own family. According to some stories that I've heard, this wasn't really in any of the sources I used. My main source, by the way, is Snopes. Just based on the stories that I've personally heard about Edward Mordrake, he decided to live in seclusion because the face was telling him to kill his family and do like all this like really horrible stuff that he himself didn't want to do, which led him to taking his own life at the young age of 23. Now, again, it depends on which story you've heard, if you've already heard about Edward Mordrake, or which source you look at if you've never heard of him. But it's said that when he killed himself, the face on the back of his head was smiling. Now, as far as the truth of the matter, there is absolutely no mention of Edward Mordrake or anyone similar with the slightest hint of similarity to Edward's story prior to the 1895 Boston Sunday Post article. It was written by Charles Lowton Hildreth, and probably the biggest hint to the falsehood of this story was the fact that Charles was a poet and a sci-fi writer. And like I said, there's no other mention of Edward Mordrake prior to this point. On top of that, the story really laid into the melodrama of Edward's life rather than focusing on things that could make it more factual. And probably the biggest piece of evidence that this might be false is that famous picture of him. It looks older, it's in black and white. It's not necessarily as high resolution as cameras were at the time of the picture being taken. I'll post it on my Instagram so you guys can see it. It still looks pretty old and vintage, but when you put it next to photos from the same time period, the late 1800s, it looks a lot higher resolution than those other photos. What it really is a retouched photo of a wax finger, and my apologies for mispronouncing it, I'm going to do my best. It's of a wax finger in the panopticum Wax Museum in Hamburg, Germany. If I have anyone who lives in Germany or knows how to speak German, let me know how to really pronounce it. I really did my best. As I mentioned, a year after the Post published that article in 1896, the Medical Encyclopedia Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine wrote about Mordrake's life. The account was directly copied from Hildreth's article. It was credited only to a lay source instead of directly sourcing the exact author. It ended up not providing any medical diagnosis for this rare deformity, although it did kind of provide some explanations for the birth defect. One of them was craniopagus parasiticus, which is a parasitic twin head with an undeveloped body. It could have been a form of diprosopus, which is a bifurcated craniofacial duplication, or an extreme form of parasitic twin, which is an unequal conjoined twin. Now, with those possibilities, that doesn't mean to say that someone who looked like Mordrake's description, it's possible that someone looked like him, but there's no evidence of he himself existing, nor anyone having a parasitic twin telling them really disturbing things. Edward Mordrake has been mentioned in a few pop culture instances. For me, I first heard about him in Ripley's Believe It or Not. To be fair, they are more of like an oddities publication rather than like they share more of the oddities, so it makes sense as to why they would report on Edward Mordrake. He was also mentioned very famously on American Horror Story Freak Show, and I think they did like a really good job with that, because someone like Edward Mordrake, if he actually existed and as described, I feel like would fit in very well with the freak show setting. So if you're interested in seeing him in something like that, or like any sort of like publication like that, using his story like they did, I definitely recommend watching that season of American Horror Story. Again, that was Freak. I can't remember which season number it is, but I just know that it's Freak Show. I think it's like season 3 or 4. It's right around the time Asylum came out. It's like right before or right after, something like that. Like I said, there are other pop culture references to him, but I didn't really focus on that part of the research. But with that being said, I will see you guys next week with another creepy episode, maybe with more hoaxes. I'm not 100% sure yet. Depends on which script I get done first for next week. Stay creepy, you guys.